Thank you, Mr. President. Last week I said on the Senate floor that serving in the United States Senate is becoming like being asked to join the Grand Ole Opry and not being allowed to sing. Now here's what I meant by that. Take last week. The Democratic leader, the distinguished majority leader, senator from Nevada, brought up unemployment compensation. How do we help unemployed Americans go to work? I can't think of an issue more important to our country. All of us have ideas about how to do this. But he brought up his idea. Hadn't been considered by committee. And then when he put it on the floor, he cut off amendments, he cut off debate, and cut off votes. Coming up soon will be minimum wage. How to increase family incomes in America is the foremost issue facing our country. We all have ideas about that. We're elected to deal with it. We're in a long period of unemployment. We believe the economy is bad for a variety of reasons. We on this side believe it has a big wet blanket of rules and regulations that have been increased by the Obama administration. We'd like to debate that. We'd like to talk about it. We don't believe the old idea of a minimum wage is the solution. We're for maximum new jobs and maximum job training and learning opportunities so people can get those jobs. We want the economy to grow. We should be debating that. That's why we're here. But the senator from Iowa, my good friend and the distinguished chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee said, no, we won't hear this in committee. There might be embarrassing amendments. Embarrassing amendments. So, Mr. President, unfortunately, insofar as the way the Senate functions, this year is beginning just like last year ended, and Republicans objected to this. Now, some of the news outlets wrote down, I read some of the stories this morning, and said, well, after a while, the Senate began to debate internal procedure and process. Well, Mr. President, sometimes process is important. We have something called the United States Constitution. It's kind of old-fashioned, has a lot of process in it. In fact, it has a checks and balances system in it that's envied by the world. There are citizens all over the world that would like to have a government that functions in the way ours has for over two centuries. Process can be very important. And in this case, as the Republican leader often says, process and procedure are substance. Because when we're not able to talk about unemployment compensation, when we're not able to offer our ideas about how to help unemployed Americans go back to work, that is substance. That's the central issue facing our country. We think we have better ideas than the idea the majority leader put on the floor, and we would like to present those ideas on behalf of the people who elected us. We are not the important ones. We're all political accidents in here, all 100 of us. We all know that. We worked pretty hard to get here, and we had some luck to go along with it. And what does that give us? Not just a chance to have our say, but to have a say on behalf of the people of Tennessee, in my case. They want me to weigh in on the big issues before our country. Obamacare is one of the reasons so many people are unemployed. I'm sure that the other side doesn't want to talk about that. I wouldn't if I had voted for it. But I was in a room with the chief executive officer of a major restaurant company who told me that because of the new costs of Obamacare on his large company, that they were going to start running their restaurants with 75 employees instead of 90 employees. That doesn't sound like more jobs to me. That doesn't sound like help for the unemployed Americans. This is the forum in which we debate these issues. So I suppose it might be embarrassing for our friends on the other side to debate these issues, but it really shouldn't be. If they believe in them, they should want to stand up and defend the issues just as strongly as we want to say our point of view. I would suspect there are a good number of my Democratic friends who have amendments that they'd like to offer on putting unemployed Americans to work. And they might wonder, how did I ever get to a United States Senate where I can't do that? Just as someone might wonder in Nashville, why did I join the Grand Ole Opry if they won't let me sing? The majority leader's actions go to the very heart of our government. It's not about internal procedure. It's not about process. It's about the major issues facing our country. Tennesseans didn't send me to Washington to rubber stamp the majority leader's ideas, not this majority leader, not any majority leader. Tennesseans sent me here to represent them and to advocate their point of view and to give them a say on Obamacare, on balancing the budget, on fixing the deficit, on helping unemployed Americans find jobs, on dealing with wages, on raising family incomes. That's why I'm here. That's my job. And they expect me to have a chance to have not my say, but their say on the issues that face the American people. And by his actions, the majority leader is destroying the Senate, which was once described as the one touch of authentic genius in the American political system. There's a new book out, which I mentioned on the floor the other day. My guess it'll become the leading history of this body. It's written by the former Senate historian, Richard Baker, and the late Neil McNeil, who wrote what many consider to be the best history of the House of Representatives. And they do say in there that the genius that I just talked about, the authentic touch of genius that is the Senate, the major reason for that is the opportunity for extended debate. They point out, as I think any of us would, that there have been abuses with the filibuster, more delays than are necessary, that the Senate didn't work as well as it should, not just in the last few years, but over a long period of time. But the fact of the matter is, in this body, which is virtually unique in the world, in requiring that 60 of 100 members must agree before we cut off debate, that helps forge consensus. That helps forge consensus, as we did on the student loan agreement earlier this year. There was a good example of a good debate, of different opinions on both sides of the aisle, of Democrats and Republicans working together. And when we finally got to 60 or 65, we got a result with the Republican House of Representatives and the Democratic president going along with us, and it was a victory for the students of this country. We cut in half the interest rates they pay and took the whole argument out of a political football. The Senate was created for three reasons: to encourage a consensus. You govern a complex society with consensus, not with ramrodding partisan ideas through one body or the other. We have a body for that. It's called the House of Representatives. Win it by one vote, and the Rules Committee has, 2 times as many members of the majority to 1, and they can pass anything they want to pass. Senate over here, the tradition has been, and you slow it down. You cool it off. You take a second look. The passions of the democracy, what de Tocqueville called in his trip across America in the early 1800s, the great danger he saw to our country was the tyranny of the majority. He saw that as one of the 2 great dangers to the American democracy. And the Senate has been through all that period of time the guardian of minority rights, the guardian of excesses of the executive. That in our country is the president, when the founders didn't want a king. So they set up this elaborate system of checks and balances, and the Senate is the key to that. And what's different about the Senate is the opportunity for extended debate. So we bring up a bill, one senator's idea, cut off debate, cut off amendment, cut off votes. That's it. That's not the way to govern our country, particularly on an issue of how do we put unemployed Americans back to work. The Senate's losing its capacity to do the things it was created to do in the following ways. Number 1, less advice and consent. On November 21st, the Democratic majority decided 60 votes are no longer needed to cut off debate on most presidential nominees. So try asking a nominee, will the National Security Agency stop monitoring the Pope? Now there will be no response because the majority can ram through any nominee. The senator from Nevada said, the distinguished majority leader, in 2006, he said, I heard him, he put it in his book, that allowing a majority to cut off debate would be the end of the Senate. The end of the Senate. Apparently he changed his mind. Operating without rules. The distinguished senator from Michigan, Senator Levin, said on November 21st, A Senate in which a majority can change the rules at any time is a Senate without rules. It's as if the Red Sox, finding themselves behind in the ninth inning in the World Series, added a couple of innings to make sure they won. When he wrote the Senate rules, Thomas Jefferson said, "It's not so important what the rule is, but there be a rule." Ignoring executive orders. While it ignores its own rules, the Senate meekly watches as the Obama administration changes the health care law, suspends immigration laws, and rewrites labor laws. Tolerating more czars. President Obama has appointed more czars than the Romanovs did. And in both Russia and the United States, czars don't report to elected representatives. Not passing appropriations bills. Hopefully that's going to change. But the Senate's repeated failure to pass appropriations bills cancels the Senate's check on the executive's power to spend. Illegal recess appointments. That's being debated today in the Supreme Court. The majority acquiesced when President Obama used his recess appointment to appoint members to the National Labor Relations Board when the Senate was not in recess. Fortunately, 3 federal appellate courts disagreed, and the Supreme Court will decide. Hopefully, the Supreme Court agrees with the appellate courts. Otherwise, the Senate might go out for lunch and return and find that we have a new Supreme Court justice. Now, there is blame to go around, and I'm sure any of my friends on the other side who are listening would be quick to point that out. Baker and McNeil, in their book, pointed that out. There have been abuses of the filibuster. It's true that some Republicans have unduly delayed nominations and unduly delayed legislation. And that's not new. I've seen it in other years. I've pointed out on this floor how the senator from Alabama, Senator Allen, in the 70s and 80s would tie the Senate into knots with his knowledge of the rules. How the senator from Ohio, Senator Metzenbaum, would sit right down there on the front row, and if you wanted to pass a bill, you had to go see him. And if you didn't amend your bill to do what he wanted done, he would use Senate rules to block it. So this has never been an easy place to get something done, but it wasn't ever supposed to be. It was supposed to be a place where every single senator is an equal, where every senator's voice is not his or her voice, but the voice of people that senator represents. It's been supposed to be a place of extended debate where almost any amendment can be discussed for almost any length of time. And usually the clock is all that would cut the debate off. But there has been a procedure by which a consensus can cut it off. And when we reach that consensus, we usually reach a result that even can pass unanimously after it's been massaged and changed and worked through and considered. I think of the legislation we just passed on compounding pharmacies and making drugs safely, making drugs more safe, 4 billion prescriptions a year that went through the committee process, through both houses, eventually passed unanimously because we had reached a consensus. But the delays that have occurred on nominations, the cause, so-called, of the change in rules on November 21, was hardly a crisis. Non-judicial presidential nominees have almost never been denied their seats by a filibuster. Before the November rules changed, 2 for President Obama, 3 for President Bush, 2 for President Clinton, none before that in history. That's 7, Mr. President. Only 7 non-judicial president nominees in the history of the Senate had ever been denied their seats by a filibuster. Now, maybe it would take a while, but that's so we can ask questions. And the day before the rules were changed, I looked at the executive calendar, this calendar that we have on our desk. It has every single nomination that can be brought to the floor. If I have my numbers about right, there were not many people on there. Half of them have been held up by the senator from South Carolina who is trying to get some answers on Benghazi. That's happened many times in this body. Senators want an answer. They do that to make the executive tell them what's going on. There are only 8, I believe, nominees who'd been on there more than 9 weeks, and only 12 others who'd been on more than 3 weeks. So there weren't very many people on the executive calendar there. And we had changed the rules to make it easier to confirm them anyway. There were 13 district judges, so the majority leader can bring them up on Thursday. Friday is the intervening day. Monday, there could be 2 hours of debate. He could confirm 4 or 5 by doing it over the weekend in that way. But no, we had to change the rules in the way that it was done. The Senate doesn't need a change of rules, Mr. President. It needs a change of behavior. And the current majority leader, I would respectfully suggest, could start by following the example of majority leaders Robert Byrd, a Democrat, and Howard Baker, a Republican, during the 1970s and 80s. Here is how they would do things. And this is the way the Senate ran until 5 or 6 years ago. Baker and Byrd would bring legislation to the floor. Usually they'd go to a committee and say to a chairman, we'll put it on the floor if you and your ranking member of the other party agree. So you'd have 2 members, a chairman and a Republican ranking member, not the leaders, standing up there at the 2 desks. They'd put the bill on the floor that already had gotten a consensus in the committee. Then the majority leader would ask for amendments to the bill, and sometimes he would get 300. 300. Then he would ask consent to cut off the offering of amendments and to consider voting on them in an orderly way, all of which was written out in the unanimous consent agreement. And of course, he would get the unanimous consent to do that because everybody who wanted to offer an amendment could. And then they would go to work. They would start on Mondays, and they would work into Monday night and on Tuesday and on Wednesday. They would table many of the amendments. It doesn't take long, 10 minutes of debate, table it with 51 votes. Senator Byrd said in his book that when the Panama Canal Treaty came up at a time when he was the majority leader and Baker was the Republican leader, that they had 200 amendments and reservations, many of them killer amendments, but he allowed every one of them. And he defeated every one of them. But he said if we hadn't allowed them, we never would have gotten the ratification of the Panama Canal Treaty. The senators had their say on the Panama Canal Treaty. And so after a while, those 300 amendments that might have been offered on Monday are whittled away. Some are accepted, some are dropped, some are voted on, some are tabled. And by about Thursday, the majority leader has said at the beginning of the week, we're going to finish the bill this week. People are ready to go home. And then they begin to think more carefully about whether their amendment's really that important or not. So they vote Thursday night, and they maybe vote Friday, and if they have to, they vote Saturday. But most of the time, they finish their work on Friday. They were not afraid, those majority leaders, to allow amendments. They were not afraid to defeat amendments. I believe that if the majority leader would allow the Senate to work in this way, he wouldn't have any problem on this side of the aisle with efforts to keep bills from coming to the floor. Almost all of the effort to keep bills from coming to the floor has to do with minority members not being allowed to have the say of the people who elected them to serve. Instead, the majority leader has set records for bringing legislation to the floor without committee approval, cutting off amendments, and records for cutting off debate. So there are no votes on reforming military sexual assaults, completing Yucca Mountain, sanctioning Iran, other vital concerns. No votes on unemployment compensation, how to put unemployed America to work. The Senate has become a Tuesday-Thursday club run by one senator and orchestrated by the White House. One reason this is tolerated is that 43 senators are in their first term. 43 senators are in their first term. Most of them in the majority. They've never served in the minority. They've never seen the Senate function properly, the way it's functioned for most of its 200-plus years history. Most importantly, those senators in their first term didn't hear Senator Byrd's final address, when, among other things, he said that any majority leader could run the Senate under the then existing rules. I asked consent to include, following my remarks, an article from the Wall Street Journal on last Friday on this subject.
Without objection.
In an important address last week, Senator McConnell, the senator from Kentucky, the Republican leader, described 3 ways to restore the Senate: full committee consideration of bills thoroughly debated with robust amendments on the floor, and a decent week's work. We might work Monday through Friday instead of Tuesday through Thursday. And Mr. President, the Senate could change overnight. It does need a change of rules. The senator from Kentucky did not say that it's always been easy to navigate the Senate. The ideal regular order never has and never will be without exceptions. But what we call the regular order has become the exception rather than the rule. I would hope that we don't wait until November or the next year to restore the Senate to its proper place as the authentic piece of genius in the American government, the unique body, the unique Senate in the world because of the opportunity for extended debate. It could change overnight by considering bills most of the time that went through committee, most of the time having a robust amendment process and debate on those bills and vote on them. And if it took Monday through Friday to get that work done, then we should do it. Otherwise, the great issues facing our country: what kind of health care system do we have? How do we help unemployed Americans go to work? How do we improve learning opportunities in this new America where so much is decentralized and so much is on social media? These are very exciting times. Daniel Burstyn, the former historian of the United States and the Librarian of Congress, in his wonderful books on America, used to talk about verges, that when America was at a verge, and we've been there many times in our history, that we were more open to innovation, that we were more self-aware of where we are, that we tended to rely on each other, and that we changed our country for the better. That's where we are today. We want better learning opportunities, better job training, better health care. Washington is in the way of much of that, and we need to debate how to change that. So I would hope my friend, the distinguished majority leader, will listen to what the Republican leader had to say and reflect on the many years he served here, and realize that all we're saying is that we'd like to have a say on behalf of the people who elected us on the great issues facing our country. Bring a bill through committee. Bring it to the floor. Let us have debate. Defeat our amendments. Should be able to with a tabling motion. And then let's come to a result. I think the American people would gain much more confidence in the United States Senate because it would deserve more confidence if it conducted issues in that way. But this diminishing of the Senate is tragic for a country with large problems to solve and whose system of checks and balances has been envied around the world. I thank the President. I yield the floor.